In the middle of the night, I saw a message on my boyfriend's phone. If you didn't have a girlfriend. He replied with one word, yes. I handed the chat to him. After a long silence, he put out his cigarette. I told you she's just a colleague. And I've already promised nothing will happen between us. Isn't that enough? As he said this, there was no expression on his face, but the disappointment and blame in his voice were unmistakable. At that moment, I realized I didn't know this person anymore. Half asleep, I heard someone opening the door. Slowly walking towards the bed, a familiar scent filled the air. I got up and reached out to wrap my arms around Clarence's neck. Just as my lips were a few centimeters from his, he suddenly turned his head, avoiding my kiss. That instinctive movement made us both freeze for a moment, and I lost all sleepiness. Maybe to avoid the awkwardness, Clarence tied his tie and went straight to the bathroom. Soon, the sound of water came from inside. Clarence had been working overtime a lot lately, often coming home very late, thinking he might not have even had time to eat. The awkwardness I felt earlier started to fade. I decided to order him some food. I reached for my phone but remembered it was still charging in the living room. I turned my head and noticed Clarence's phone casually lying next to the pillow. I picked it up and ordered him a bowl of bone broth noodles from a place he frequented. After placing the order, just as I was about to turn off the screen, a notification from myboyfriend popped up. The delivery of a buy for me order had been completed. The order was for a bag of brown sugar and a box of Tian-Kai dismineration capsules. Then another message popped up on the screen. The painkillers were, thanks. I froze, my fingers hovering above the screen for a long time before I tapped it. The most recent chat was from half an hour ago. Clarence, when you left just now. The other person replied with a sad emoji. Clarence, I finished the proposal. The reply came quickly, great. That means I can sleep and tomorrow and come to the office later. Clarence. A little later, Clarence asked, are you okay? There was no reply. 5 minutes later, Clarence sent another message. I bought you some things. Make sure to stay warm these next few days. Clarence hadn't saved a note for the contact, but from the profile picture and the content, it was obvious who it was. It was Cynthia. The first time I heard the name Cynthia was a month ago. That day, Clarence had accompanied me to a movie. Halfway through, I noticed he seemed distracted. When I looked back at him, I saw he was looking down at his phone. A slight smile on his lips, his expression relaxed and soft. I hesitated for a moment before asking, what are you looking at? Clarence, still looking at his phone, answered with a smile in his voice, Cynthia. The atmosphere grew tense for a second. That was the first time I had heard the name Cynthia from Clarence's mouth. He said it slowly, sounding unusually pleasant. As if realizing something, he suddenly looked up at me. After a few seconds of eye contact, he handed me his phone and explained seriously. Cynthia is a new colleague at work. She's very hardworking. I just see her as a junior I'm mentoring. I stared at the screen. In the video, the girl seemed to be celebrating her birthday. Someone had smeared cake on her face, but she didn't mind. Instead, it was clear she had a great personality. The video was shared in the group by a colleague. I just clicked on it randomly. Clarence took my hand and held it tightly. His warmth unmistakable. His voice was as gentle as ever. Daphne, trust me. I looked at him for a long time. His expression was calm, not like someone lying. But somehow, I couldn't stop thinking about the smile he had just moments ago. We didn't say another word for the rest of the movie. I didn't expect that everything had already been set in motion. 10 minutes later, the bathroom door opened. Clarence came out wearing pajamas, his hair still wet. When our eyes met, he paused, clearly taken aback. You went through my phone? I was about to speak when I couldn't help but cough softly. Clarence watched me for a moment before hesitantly asking, are you sick? I nodded lightly. Autumn had arrived, and I had always been weak, prone to severe colds and fevers if I wasn't careful. Over the 5 years we'd been together, Clarence had always been overly cautious whenever the seasons changed. He would check the weather every day, or dragging me to the gym to build on my resistance, doing everything he could to keep me healthy. I used to tease him for being overly worried, and he would wrap his arms around my waist, his head resting on my shoulder, mumbling, "I just don't want you to get sick. Not even a cold." But recently, in this strange, unspoken tension between us, it seemed he hadn't noticed any of these changes. "I'd just been too busy with work lately." Clarence's voice pulled me for my thoughts. He didn't know when he had sat down next to the bed, but he adjusted my blanket, a faint guilt in his eye. "It won't happen again." I was still holding his phone, and I couldn't help but ask, "Is it really just work?" "We're nothing," Cynthia and I. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, his tone full of exhaustion. I didn't say a word, instead showing him the chat I just found. It was from 3 days ago. Cynthia seemed to have been drunk and had messaged him in the middle of the night, "If you didn't have a girlfriend, would you like me?" Clarence had only responded with one word, "Yeah." Seeing that, Clarence froze. After a moment of silence, he put out his cigarette and looked at me. "I told you she's just a colleague. And I've already promised nothing will happen between us. Isn't that enough?" As he said that, there was no emotion on his face, but the disappointment and blame in his voice were clear. At that moment, I felt like I didn't know this person at all anymore. In the middle of our argument, Clarence's phone rang again. The message flashed on the screen. It was from Cynthia, asking if he had eaten yet. Another message followed shortly after. "I bet you have. I ordered you some bone broth noodles from that place I took you to last time." I stared blankly at the message, feeling like my heart was being squeezed so tightly that I could barely breathe. Clarence didn't even use to like noodle. When he was a child, his family was poor. His father passed away early, and his mother worked far from home, often leaving him alone without enough to eat. Clarence was introverted and quiet at that time, so the neighborhood kids didn't like playing with him, but I often visited him. One day, I brought something over to his house and saw him sitting on a bench, head lowered, silently eating noodles, just plain broth, without a single vegetable. When he noticed me watching, he seemed a bit flustered for a moment, but he quickly composed himself, acting as if nothing had happened, then continued eating. I stared at his thin profile, feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness. Perhaps it was because I could relate. My mom always wanted a son, but due to complications during my birth, she was told she might never have more children. Because of that, those hopeless, lonely days were ones Clarence and I endured together, offering each other companionship and comfort. Bit by bit, everything changed when Clarence graduated from middle school. His mother's business took off, even making the financial news at the time, and she took him away. I didn't see him for a long time after that until we met again in college. After we got together, I noticed Clarence never ate noodles. I could guess why he didn't want to remember this difficult time. But recently, I've seen him bringing home takeout from the noodle shop on the corner more and more. At first, I joked with him about it, asking why he suddenly liked noodles. He responded casually, "No reason. I just felt like eating them." At the time, I felt relieved, thinking he had finally moved on. Turns out, it was because of her. I broke up with Clarence. While zipping up my suitcase, Clarence suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Daphne, are you really going to leave?" I was forced to look up at him. I used to love the way Clarence looked at me, gentle and focused, like nothing else in the world mattered. I remembered that time in our sophomore year when my roommate and I planned a trip to Bali, but she bailed at the last minute. Since I'd already bought the tickets and planned the whole thing, I decided to go alone. On my second day, I went hiking. As the soft glow of dawn began to spill through the misty mountains, I saw a familiar face. It was Clarence. "I thought you were still in Beijing for that competition?" I asked, surprised but happy. Clarence rubbed his hands together and took off his scarf, wrapping it around me. His face and ears read from the cold. His voice trembled slightly. "I saw on social media that you came to Bali alone to watch the sunrise, and I got worried. So I rushed back early. I wanted to watch it with you," Clarence said, staring directly at me. The golden sunlight reflected in his eyes, but the warmth settled in my heart. After that trip, our relationship changed, and not long after, we started dating. But now things seemed different. I hadn't changed, I still only had eyes for him, but all he gave me was frustration and impatience. Maybe he didn't even realize it himself. Snapping back to reality, I pulled my hand away and avoided his gaze. I'll finish packing tonight and move out tomorrow morning, I said. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Around midnight, I finally finished packing. And I collapsed on the bed and opened my phone to see a new friend request on Cynthia. After I accepted, she didn't say anything. Out of curiosity, I opened her social media. Her latest post was just a few minutes old. The first was a selfie with a steaming bowl of bone broth noodles on the table behind her. The second was another bowl of bone broth noodles. Taken in a setting I recognized immediately, the table had a plaid pattern, with a vase of vibrant roses on top. It was the vase Clarence and I had picked out together during a trip to the supermarket. Cynthia had captioned it, having noodles with a certain someone. This is a private post for just one person to see. Clarence had liked the post. I didn't sleep well that night. My dreams alternated between memories. One moment, I was a child, carefully applying ointment to the bruises on Clarence's face, crying from how much it hurt me even before he had the chance to react. The next, watching the sunrise, with his cool hand gently wrapping around mine and tucking both into his pocket. But by the end of the dream, Clarence was holding Cynthia instead, and they walked past me without even a glance. The dream felt so real that when I woke up the next morning and saw Cynthia in person, I was stunned. I'd only ever seen her in videos on Clarence's phone. Come to think of it, this was our first time meeting in real life. Honestly, Cynthia was quite beautiful, pale skin, with a long, slender neck. She was sitting on the couch, her face slightly tilted up, and there seemed to be a small cut on her forehead, with a bit of dried blood. Clarence was tending to the wound, gently pressing a cloth against it with one hand while holding her chin steady with the other, his movements careful and precise. Cynthia winced, letting out a small hiss of pain. Clarence noticeably slowed down, the concern in his eyes clearly visible in the light streaming through the blind. It made the whole scene painfully obvious from where I stood on the stairs. I loosened my grip on the suitcase handle, and it dropped with a loud thud. Hearing the noise, Clarence looked back and frowned, but didn't say a word. It was Cynthia who spoke first, confidently introducing herself and explaining that she was just dropping off some documents for Clarence since he had to meet with a client. The elevator in your building broke. Tried to take the stairs, and I tripped on my way up. Sorry for causing trouble. I didn't respond. I walked straight to the door, suitcase in hand. Just as I reached for the handle, Clarence grabbed my wrist again, this time with an air of authority. He glared at me, frustration dripping from his voice. Haven't you had enough of this? His grip was tight, making my wrist shake. I struggled, but the more I fought, the harder he squeezed. In the tussle, his sleeve slid up. I froze. Just last month, for Clarence's birthday, I bought him but when I went to give it to him, I noticed he was already wearing this gray one. I couldn't see the brand, but from the style and design, it was obvious that the watch was expensive. Clarence casually said that it was a gift from a friend. Clarence's family situation is much better than mine, but he always took care of my feelings. That was the first time I felt a sense of inferiority and pressure because of the difference in our financial situations. I didn't show it at the time, but Clarence still sensed something. He sighed softly, wrapped his arms around me from behind, and with his warm lips close to my ear, he spoke in a low and gentle voice. It doesn't matter what watch I wear. What matters is the one you gave me. From that day on, Clarence put away the expensive watch and wore the one I gave him every day. I never thought that on the first day after we broke up, he would wear that gray watch again. Suddenly, I found it a bit amusing and calmly said, "Moo." Clarence realized something too and quickly pulled his hand back, his voice a bit unnatural. The client I'm meeting today is really important for the company. Before he could finish, Cynthia suddenly spoke up, reminding him it was time to leave for the meeting. I glanced at her and, thinking of something, asked Clarence, "Is that watch from her?" Clarence remained silent for a while before saying, "Daphne, it's just a watch." I didn't want to talk to him any further. I picked up my phone, but before I could make the call, Dante arrived. Dante's my younger brother. 5 years younger than me. My mom never gave up on having a son. Seeking treatments everywhere and trying all kinds of remedies and acupuncture, wasting a lot of money. Finally, she got pregnant again. Over the years, my mom poured all her love and favoritism into my brother while remaining cold to me, but my relationship with my brother has always been good. Only one suitcase? Dante scratched his head, looking a bit uncertain. Yeah. Oh, I thought girls always had tons of bags when moving out. I couldn't do it alone. So I called Donahue to help. I froze for a moment. Donahue? Yeah, Donahue just got back from a business trip in Shanghai. And I dragged him here before Ante could finish. His phone rang. A deep voice came through. Are you guys done? Yeah. We're coming down now. No need to come up, Dante replied, lifting my suitcase. Sith. Let's go. Without hesitation, I grabbed my bag and followed him out. Behind me, Clarence seemed to be calling my name, but I didn't stop, nor did I look back at him once. Donahue's car was parked by the roadside. As we walked up, he was sitting inside, tapping his long fingers on the steering wheel, lost in thought. I stared at his sharply defined profile, momentarily dazed. Donahue was my high school classmate, known as the top student of our grade. He was cold and aloof, and I was shy. So despite sitting next to each other, we hardly ever spoke. After graduation, I thought I would never cross paths with him again. That was until 2 months ago when Dante started an internship at a securities company. And I found out Donahue was his boss when I went to visit. Donahue? Dante called out suddenly. The man in the driver's seat turned his head, and our eyes met. I greeted him politely. Then, after some thought, just as I was about to get in, Donahue said, "Sit in the front. You get car sick, sitting in the front will help," he added in a calm tone. I paused, surprised, but didn't ask how he knew. Silently, I closed the back door and sat in the passenger seat. None of us spoke during the drive. We arrived home at around 2 p.m. Donahue dropped us off and drove back to the office. My mom came out of the kitchen carrying the bowls of food. She shot me a cold look, her expression less than friendly. When she saw Dante, her face softened, and she said gently, "The food is ready. Come and eat." Dinner was unusually quiet. My mom doesn't like me. Once I find a suitable place, I'll move out again. In the evening, my mom sat on the couch knitting. Maybe it was her eyesight due to old age, but she didn't notice the ball of gray yarn had fallen to the floor. I walked over, picked it up silently, and placed it back on the coffee table. Just as I was about to head back to my room, her angry voice stopped me. "Why did you break up with Clarence?" I stood still, not saying anything. Clarence told me, "It's just a watch from a female colleague. Nothing serious. Why are you making such a fuss?" I looked at her in disbelief, my throat feeling dry. It's always been like this. When I was little, I told her about being bullied by classmates who purposely tripped me. She was busy feeding my brother and showed no emotion when she heard me. Instead, she scolded me. "What's the point of telling me? Why don't they bully anyone else? You should look at yourself and figure out why." Back then, I never expected her to say something so cold, and I just stood there, stunned. My brother took the opportunity to pull my hair, and I instinctively pushed him back. Before I could react, a hard slap landed on my face. My mom was comforting my crying brother while glaring at me. I ran out of the house with tears in my eyes. I don't remember how long I ran, but I finally stopped when I had no strength left, burying my face in my knees. In the end, it was Clarence who found me. He gently patted my back, not saying a word, as if soothing all my hurt little by little. At that moment, I thought, maybe my mom would never take my side, but Clarence always would. Be reasonable. He'll come to pick you up tomorrow, and you should give him a way out. Just let this go. My mom's scolding voice brought me back to reality. She glanced at me before lowering her head to continue knitting. "Think about your brother if not yourself. Clarence's mother is such an influential person, with so many resources. Your brother's future." I didn't know how I got back to my room. The room was dark, with no lights on. Outside, heated arguing could be heard, but I sat motionless by the bed. After a long time, the door opened. Someone gently embraced me, their forehead resting on my shoulder. A choked voice, painfully restrained, broke the silence of the night. "I'm sorry. I don't know why she's like this. We're both her kids, after all." I turned around to look at him. Tears streaked the face that looked so much like mine, and his eyes were red. In the past, I tried to hate Dante, to channel all my anger toward my mother, my resentment, and the love I could never receive into hatred for Dante, as if that would somehow make me feel better. But after he grew up, he treated me so well that I couldn't even bring myself to hate him. I rented an apartment and just signed the lease. I planned to live there myself, but you should move in first, I heard him say firmly. Your future is yours. My future is my responsibility. And you don't have to do anything you don't want to, for me or anyone else. I'll help you move tomorrow, he added. Before bed, I received a WeChat message from Cynthia. If that watch caused a misunderstanding, I can explain. I ignored it. 10 minutes later, Cynthia sent another message. Last month, my mom brought 2 watches back from abroad. I kept one of the women's watches for myself, and since it was close to Clarence's birthday, I gave the other one to him without thinking much about it. She followed up with, "Clarence knows too." I stayed silent for a moment before typing. "Are you saying you also have a watch just like his?" Cynthia didn't reply. The next morning, I packed my suitcase and left with Dante, taking the DD ride we had booked earlier. Through the rear-view mirror, I saw my mom standing at the door. Her lips moved as if she were saying something, but in the end, I couldn't hear her. On the way, Florent called several times and sent dozens of WeChat messages, asking where I was. I only replied briefly. "We've broken up." It took a long time before he responded. "Daphne, I didn't agree to this." I'd immediately blocked him on all platforms. Dante's rented apartment was a small 2-bedroom unit with a clean, modern design, and it was conveniently close to my office. We spent the whole afternoon unpacking and organizing, and by the time we finished, Dante collapsed on the sofa, lazily saying, "Sis, you have to treat me to a big meal tonight." I smiled and agreed. While booking a restaurant, I thought for a moment and asked Dante to invite Donahue as a thank you for helping us move yesterday. Traffic was a bit heavy, so Dante and I arrived at the restaurant over an hour late. Donahue was already seated, waiting. His head was slightly lowered, one hand resting on his bent knee, the other stirring his coffee. A noisy world around him seemed out of sync with his calm presence. For a brief moment, I remembered a high school lunch break when I woke up from a nightmare, trying to catch my breath. I glanced at Donahue out of the corner of my eye. He was working on a problem, sitting up straight, his fingers holding a pen as he calculated on scratch paper. His nails were neatly trimmed. When he noticed my gaze, he glanced at me, then handed me a tissue before returning to his work. It wasn't until much later that I realized what happened and used the tissue to wipe my forehead, only to see that it was soaked with sweat. I snapped back to reality as Dante, sitting beside me. "Oh no, I'm already late for work. And now I'm late for dinner with him too. He's going to kill me for this." I pulled Dante over, sincerely apologizing. "Sorry we're late. Order whatever you want. Don't worry about saving me money." Donahue looked at me for a moment before smiling. "It's fun. I just got here too." He called the waiter and casually handed me the menu. "Why don't you order?" Halfway through the meal, soft piano music began playing in the restaurant. That's when I noticed the large platform in the center of the dining area with a white piano on it. A girl was sitting there, playing with her back to the audience. The wall behind her was covered in love knots. Dante cleared his throat and said quietly, "It's a special marketing feature here. Couples who play the piano get a love knot with their names on it. So a lot of couples come here just for the..." Distracted by my food, I obstinately replied, "Oh," and ended up choking. I lowered my head, coughing quietly, and felt someone gently patting my back. I looked up to see a bowl of soup pushed toward me. Following the elegant hand holding the bowl, I raised my gaze and found myself staring into Donahue's dark eyes. I froze. Donahue paused too, then quickly grabbed Angie's bowl and served him some soup as well. Dante blinked in confusion. I wasn't the one choking. He's baffled. Donahue remained silent. The atmosphere became slightly awkward. Dante glanced between Donahue and me before quietly excusing himself to the restroom. As the piano music ended, I instinctively looked over. The girl on stage turned around. It was Cynthia. She smiled as she accepted the love note from the staff, lowered her head to write something on it, and then returned to her seat. As expected, sitting across from her was Clarence. He was holding the love note in his hand. Up from where I sat, I couldn't see his expression. Cynthia leaned in. Suddenly, he laughed, perhaps sensing that someone was staring intently at him. He lifted his head and met my gaze. For a brief moment, there was clear shock in his eyes, and his expression darkened. The next second, he was already striding over to me. His eyes lingered on Donahue's face for a moment before turning to me, and in a questioning tone, he asked, "What's your relationship with him?" The accusatory tone immediately ignited a surge of anger within me. My gaze dropped to the object he was gripping tightly, and I asked calmly, "Do you think the lover's not as beautiful?" Clarence's expression changed slightly, and after a long pause, he said, "It's not what you think." I stared at him steadily, unable to understand why. Even now, he acted as if he had done nothing wrong. The memory of the once pure and sincere boy who always looked at me with tenderness seemed to blur more and more. "It's just like that." Cynthia suddenly approached, looking completely at ease. "Clarence and I were betting earlier. If I could win the lover's knot, he'd pay for dinner today." He probably didn't expect me to know how to play the piano. I looked at her expressionlessly. "You're saying this was another misunderstanding?" She smiled faintly. "Of course." Clarence seemed to let out a sigh of relief, the last trace of unease in his eyes gradually fading away, replaced by that familiar silent reprimand. As if to say, "Daphne, see, you're just making a fuss over nothing." Amidst the absurdity, I suddenly felt exhausted. After a long silence, I quietly asked him, "Do you still love me?" Clarence was taken aback, glancing instinctively at Cynthia before quickly averting his gaze. He looked at me and firmly said, emphasizing every word, "Daphne, I love you." That moment made my heart contract sharply. I knew very well that Clarence didn't necessarily like Cynthia that much. I also believed he genuinely loved me, but when he loved me too intensely. So much so that when he loved me less, it became so obvious that even someone as oblivious as me could see right through it. I once heard someone say that destruction is always the easiest, and just like that, my feelings for him vanished in the moment he looked at Cynthia. In that brief hesitation, Clarence seemed to realize something and reached out to touch my cheek, but I subtly avoided his hand. His movement froze, and a flash of panic and helplessness appeared in his eyes. "Daphne, I admit I've made a lot of mistakes before, and I apologize for that. But the lover's knot thing really is a misunderstanding. I never thought about being with her. Please, forgive me." I looked at him calmly, catching a glimpse of Cynthia's pale face out of the corner of my eye. Then, a sudden scoff broke the silence, soft but dripping with sarcasm. "Excuse me. May I ask the two of you something?" Donahue slowly stood up, looking at Clarence and Cynthia as if he was about to enjoy a good show. "Do you know the meaning behind the lover's knot?" Clarence glared at him coldly, saying nothing. "It seems you do." Donahue smiled, his voice laced with faint disdain. "Pretending to be friends while doing things couples do. You two really have an understanding." Clarence's face turned deathly pale. The ride back was in Donahue's car. The roads were quiet late at night. Then Donahue drove steadily. Dante had fallen asleep in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket. Soft music played in the car. Just as I yawned, I heard Donahue's deep voice. "It'll be about another half an hour. Do you want to take a nap?" I shook my head. "No, it's fine." The car fell silent again. As I dazedly stared ahead, my gaze drifted to Donahue. He was focused on driving, his profile looking particularly cold and sharp in the dim night light. I suddenly thought of what he had said to Clarence earlier. "I have a question." Donahue made a sound of acknowledgement. "If you had a girlfriend but fell for another girl." Donahue glanced at me. His tone light and slow. "I've always been loyal, so I don't have that kind of hypothetical." I was momentarily speechless, avoiding his gaze. "But if it happened?" He was silent for a moment. "A brief crush might be normal, but people should have clear boundaries. If you fall for someone else and cross the line, but can't let go of your current partner, then no matter the gender, that person is absolute trash." I listened in silence, and only after a moment did I realize something. Unable to help teasing. "You know how to insult people," Donahue answered matter-of-factly. "Only trash." I was speechless. Even after getting out of the car and closing the door, I was still in a bit of a daze. I realized that Donahue was different from what I remembered, more real, and not as unapproachable as I once thought. Over the next month, I threw myself entirely into my work. Clarence tried to see me several times, always waiting for me outside my office, speaking in a soft, sincere tone. Even though I ignored him every time, he never gave up, showing up like clockwork every day. I worked late, then a colleague brought up some bread, sharing a piece with me. She hesitated before saying, "It's raining heavily outside. And your ex, he's been standing outside the whole time. He refused to come in." My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly grabbed an umbrella and rushed downstairs. The rain was indeed pouring down when I walked out of the building. Clarence was standing in the rain, water dripping from his short hair down his chin, completely soaked. In silence, I walked over to him with the umbrella. "Come with me." Under the curious stares of a few passers-by, I led Clarence into the office building and handed him a pack of tissues to dry his face. Clarence sat down slowly, a smile in his voice. "Daphne, you still care about me?" I looked at the unintentional smugness in his eyes, suddenly feeling irritated. "Wait until the rain lets up. Then leave." Clarence froze, and his tone immediately softened. I didn't handle the thing with Cynthia well, but between me and her the mention of her name made me inexplicably annoyed, and I cut him off coldly. "I don't want to hear any more of your explanations. We're done." Perhaps my tone was too cold, as Clarence's face also darkened. "Are you really going to break up with me over such a small thing?" I looked up at him in shock, feeling a deep chill run through me. Clarence seemed to suddenly realize what he had just said and quickly apologized. "I'm sorry. I just can't understand. Nothing happened between us." "So how did things end up like this?" He frowned, and his expression was genuinely confused. "What do you want from me, Daphne?" "Nothing happened between me and her, and because of this insignificant message, you want to break up with me?" After saying this, a hint of impatience flashed across his face. Perhaps he really didn't understand why, despite having lowered his stance to appease me, I was so relentless. But was he truly unaware? He repeatedly indulged and allowed Cynthia to get close, relishing the thrill hidden beneath the facade of tranquility. Did he ever think that one day I would discover the truth? Or did he know he had crossed my line, but hoped I would soften? I numbly reached up to touch my face, which felt cold and damp. Clarence frantically grabbed some tissues to help wipe my tears. "Clarence, you said nothing happened between you two, right?" Clarence hesitated for a few seconds before nodding. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots of Cynthia's private we took moments along with her previous explanation about the watch. "What about now?" I asked. "You say there's nothing between you. So why are you doing things that couples do?" Clarence's face gradually drained of color. Then finally, I heard my own weak voice ask, "Clarence, you used to hardly eat noodles. Why have you suddenly taken a liking to bone soup noodles recently?" That night, the rain fell heavily, the sound of raindrops almost drowning out everything else around us. Clarence fell silent for a long time, and in the end, he quietly faded into the rain. A month passed. During this month, Clarence hadn't contacted me. Dante took me hiking several times to help me relax, but he always brought Donahue along. As a result, my relationship with Donahue has improved recently. We're at least friends now. In a few days, it would be the Mid-Autumn Festival, and my workload had increased, making me stay late almost every day until 9 or 10 o'clock. My dad usually doesn't reach out unless it's something important, but today he suddenly sent me a WeChat message. Daphne, are you coming home for the Mid-Autumn Festival? Your mom bought a lot of hairy crabs. I thought for a moment and replied, I'm really busy with work. I might have to work overtime. It took my dad a long time to respond, take care of your health. The day before the holiday, an unfamiliar number called me, and I found out it was Cynthia. She asked if I had time to grab a coffee. After thinking for a long time, I replied, okay. The CS Cynthia chose was not far from my office, so I took a taxi there after work. When I sat down, Cynthia's first words were, I don't want Clarence anymore. I looked at her, bewildered, suddenly wondering if she had some kind of serious ailment. After we left the restaurant that day, I confessed to Clarence. Cynthia paused for a moment, her own indifferent, but the bitterness in her voice was hard to ignore. He explicitly rejected me this time. This time, I curled my lips and took a sip of my coffee. I haven't given up. I've been by his side all these days, but he's been increasingly distant, his refusal more resolute each time. At a company dinner, some colleagues jokingly tried to set us up, and his expression immediately turned cold. He warned them not to joke around, saying he has a girlfriend. Cynthia let out a cold laugh, but everyone knew he had already broken up with you. I paused, gripping the coffee cup. I didn't understand what Clarence meant by doing that. What broke my heart the most was, Cynthia suddenly looked up, her eyes slightly reddening. After the dinner ended, I was worried, so I followed him home and saw him go to your building. She paused for a while before continuing. I happened to see you go upstairs with a man. I froze for a moment. A rush of memories flooded my mind. That day Cynthia mentioned was probably last weekend when on China and I went hiking. While descending, Donahue and I were discussing the strange nicknames of our classmates from high school. Ante suddenly interjected. The last time I saw Donahue video call his mom. She called him Kiao Kiao and urged him to find a girlfriend. I looked at Donahue in surprise. Kiao Kiao? Donahue's ears turned red, but he tried to appear nonchalant. He replied softly, and added seriously, please don't call me that again. I tried to suppress my laughter, but for some reason, I found it hilariously funny, and I couldn't stop giggling while Donahue remained silent the whole time. Unfortunately, my joy turned into a misfortune as I accidentally sprained my ankle. After they dropped me off at home, I suddenly remembered that we had run out of iodine and cotton swabs. So I asked Dante, who knew the way, to go to a nearby pharmacy to get some. It was Donahue who helped me upstairs. I didn't expect this to be misinterpreted by Clarence, but there was no need to explain anymore. I've never seen Clarence like that before. Cynthia whispered, as if trying to hide something. He's usually such a neat person, but there he was, curled up on the floor, trembling with his shoulders. I heard him crying. Cynthia let out a bitter laugh. At that moment, I realized he truly regretted it. She raised her hand to wipe her eyes and then, as if nothing had happened, stared straight at me. But it's too late now. You won't forgive him, will you? I looked into her eyes. The tension and probing in her eyes were evident. Suddenly, I understood the real reason she had called me over today and inexplicably said these things to me. She wanted to know if Clarence's deep feelings and regret could win my return. I stood up expressionlessly, picked up my bag, and glanced at her. You don't need to put in all this effort anymore. My relationship with Clarence is completely over. Cynthia was momentarily taken aback, a fleeting look of embarrassment crossing her face as if she had been seen through. But ultimately she sighed in relief. During the Mid-Autumn Festival these days, I didn't have to work overtime and didn't go home. I just stayed in my rented room writing a quarterly proposal. Dante sent me something, a hand-woven scarf. It was a milk gray color, soft to the touch and very warm, perfect for the current weather, but I didn't wear it. I put it away in a drawer. After staying up several nights, I still made no progress on the proposal. After a while, I felt my limbs weaken, and I couldn't muster any energy. Using the little strength I had left, I opened my phone, searched my contacts, and tried to call Dante. when the call connected. However, it was Donahue's voice. Daphne? Only then did I realize I had dialed the wrong number. Before I could say a word, my vision went black, and I fell into complete darkness. When I woke up again, I was in a hospital bed. An IV was in my wrist, and the room was filled with the strong smell of disinfectant. There were a few people gathered nearby, seemingly talking about something. Donahue was sitting next to me with a notebook, engrossed in typing. The soft light illuminated his pale skin, highlighting even the tiny hairs on his arm. I tried to speak but found my voice hoarse. "You're awake?" Donahue immediately closed his laptop, picked up a thermos from the bedside, and poured me a cup of water. He stood at the edge of the bed, watching me drink. Slowly, he said, "When you didn't say a word on the phone this morning and didn't hang up, I guess something might have happened." I texted Dante. "Since he's further away, he told me where you keep the spare key to your house." So I went over first. My head was still a bit fuzzy from just waking up. After processing this long explanation, I heard him say, "The doctor said you fainted due to excessive fatigue and low blood sugar from lack of sleep." I touched my nose, feeling a sense of guilt that came from nowhere. I'd just been too busy with work lately. Donahue stared at me for a while before suddenly smiling. "Just like high school, working yourself to the bone." I was momentarily taken aback and asked uncomfortably. Donahue looked at me, then chuckled softly, his voice calm. "He went to buy you some food. Do you want to sleep a little more?" I instinctively nodded but hesitated for a few seconds before asking, "Did anyone else come to see me while I was unconscious?" Donahue was silent for a moment before softly replying, "Your mom came earlier." I lowered my head, my fingers tightly gripping the blanket. At that moment, I'd vaguely recalled seeing my mom with red eyes, anxiously asking the doctor, "Is my daughter okay?" It was the first time I had seen my mom cry for me out of worry. It felt so unreal that I thought I was dreaming. Suddenly, I felt a gentle tap on my head. The hand was warm and dry, both soothing and tender. I looked up abruptly, only to meet Donahue's gaze. The atmosphere suddenly became a bit delicate. Then he seemed to see something and paused for a moment, following his line of sight. I slowly turned my head. Clarence was standing at the door, though I had no idea how long he had been there. The corners of his eyes were slightly red. In just a month, Clarence seemed to have completely changed. His complexion was poor, his shirt wrinkled, and stubble was starting to show on his chin. He had deep dark circles under his eyes, indicating he hadn't rested well for a long time. Those childhood experiences made Clarence pay great attention to these life details. His buttons were always neatly fastened, and he had a refreshing presence that felt like a breath of spring. It was the first time I had seen him so disheveled and worn out. I suddenly felt an indescribable emotion. Did I feel sorry for him? Maybe a bit. But more than that, it was a sense of melancholy that I could no longer return to the past. He had indeed developed feelings for Cynthia, whether it was a fleeting novelty or a momentary infatuation. Unconsciously, his inner balance had tilted toward another person. I wanted to believe he truly regretted it, but so what? That thorn was already deeply embedded in my heart. Every time I saw him, it sank deeper, and the pain intensified. Having once possessed him, who looked at me with such affection, how could I continue to be with him now? While I was lost in thought, Clarence had already approached with a thermos, his tone revealing a hint of caution. "Daphne, I heard you were sick, so I made your favorite crab porridge." I snapped back to reality and noticed a band-aid on his finger. He must have hurt himself while cooking the crab porridge when he was young, so he learned to cook for himself and would eat alone. After his circumstances improved, he had never stepped into the kitchen again. I hadn't expected him to make porridge for me. I realized I didn't have any soy sauce at home while cooking, and by the time I bought some, the porridge almost burned. Clarence said, opening the thermos lid and smiling sheepishly. I tried several more times before I managed to get it right. I watched him in silence. Somehow, I suddenly thought of how Clarence had repeatedly taken Cynthia out for bone soup noodles, effortlessly giving her exceptions I had never enjoyed. "So, Clarence, are you trying to make up for it?" My eyes suddenly felt incredibly dry. Clarence, we've broken up. You don't need to do this anymore. He stiffened abruptly, staring at me blankly. A bit at a loss. I said, Daphne. I've really cleared things up with Cynthia. I promise she won't come to disturb our lives anymore. Clarence's lips moved nervously, his voice trembling, almost incoherent. It was all my fault before. I don't even know what was wrong with me back then. I knew how she felt about me, yet I let myself get close to her. I let out a soft laugh, unable to tell if it was sarcastic or something else. Clarence's eyes suddenly turned red, and he reached out to grab my hand. I instinctively pulled away. His hand abruptly froze in my draft for a few seconds before retracting. When did you start to like her? I asked calmly. Clarence furrowed his brow, seemingly wanting to argue but finding no word. Finally murmuring, at that time, we happened to be working on a project together. She was really diligent and hardworking. I saw in her a reflection of the way you used to be. I know I love you, but I still did so many things that hurt you. Daphne, I really realized my mistake. Clarence suddenly stopped, his gaze darkening. A light breeze rustled outside the window, and Ifyou naturally leaned over, tucking away the stray hairs blown onto my forehead behind my ear. He had a faint, pleasant scent, not overpowering or intrusive, just nice. I felt my body tensed slightly and instinctively said, thank you. Ifyou helped pull up the blanket and tucked in the edges, responding slowly, you're welcome. While I was still pondering the meaning of his word, Ifyou met Clarence's gaze and said lightly, you can continue. Clarence fell silent. It took a long time before he slowly raised his head to look at me, his eyes red. No matter what I do, it's pointless, right? I calmly met his gaze. Some things I just can't pretend never happened. Clarence lowered his eyelids and gently set the thermos he was holding on the table. His voice low and obscure. I'm sorry. He walked slowly, his back slightly hunched. It was only a few steps to the door, but it took him a long time to get there. The bright light in the hospital room stretched his shadow long, adding to the sense of loneliness. Soon, only Ifyou and I remained in the room. He opened the thermos and took a look, deep in thought. Did you always cook when you were with him? No wonder, Ifyou replied, closing the lid. A glimmer of sympathy for the ingredients in his eyes. Then he looked at me. I'm not a bad cook. I was taken aback. Suddenly, the door opened, and a nurse came in to change the IV bag. Ifyou naturally averted his gaze, picking up his notebook to type. After the nurse left, I pulled up the blanket, planning to continue sleeping. Ifyou's voice broke the silence. Daphne, I slightly closed my eyes and responded gently. Didn't what he said just now touch your heart at all? His voice was low but clear in the quiet hospital room. I remained silent for a long time. No. Ifyou seemed to chuckle softly. That's good. I opened my eyes, sitting up straight and looking at him. He was staring back at me, unflinching. Suddenly, I recalled the look in his eyes when he leaned in to help me tie my hair. Intuition told me it wasn't just my imagination. For some inexplicable reason, I asked, are you? Yes? As if knowing what I was going to say, answering straightforwardly. I was stunned. He gazed at me steadily, his brow and eyes gentle, emotions clear in his gaze. So, Daphne, what do you think? I stayed in the hospital for 2 days, and when I was discharged, Ifyou came to pick me up. He opened the passenger door for me, holding it with one hand and waiting for me to get in before he went around to the driver's seat. I felt a bit nervous and couldn't help but glance at him. That day in the hospital, I had rejected him. Ifyou had indeed helped me a lot during this time. I felt grateful and moved by him. However, gratitude and heart fluttering were two different things. Before I had truly let go of the past, I didn't want to easily accept another relationship. It would not only be irresponsible to myself but also unfair to Ifyou. Ifyou seemed to have anticipated this. A hint of disappointment flickered in his eyes, but vanished quickly. I understand. Perhaps my gaze was too complex. He smiled faintly. It's your right to refuse me. Saying this, he reached out to ruffle my hair, his tone softening. his deep voice carrying a calming strength. Don't feel burdened. The sound of honking from the vehicles behind us pulled me back to reality. As I was about to fasten my seatbelt, a long hand reached over. Although it was a cool touch, I felt as if I had been burned and quickly pulled my hand back. Donahue, however, took the seatbelt from my hand and effortlessly buckled it for me. My face warmed slightly, and I unconsciously looked past him out the window. Didn't Dante say he was coming to pick me up today? So he applied for a business trip. Donahue started the engine. Resting his hand on the steering wheel, his tone gentle. He told you that if anything comes up these days, you can just find me, I softly replied with taking out my phone, which had a few WeChat messages from Dante that were sent half an hour ago. He had sent a crying emoji, complaining about being sent on a business trip by someone and not being able to pick me up. He also sent a meme with a real person's face, saying, someone. I looked at the screen, where a strange angle photo of Donahue was taken. Yet he still looked good, and I fell into contemplation. The night wind was cool and gentle, blowing in through the car window, very comfortable. I suddenly realized that every time I got into Donahue's car, he would open the window halfway in advance to keep me from feeling carsick and avoid me getting cold from the wind. I couldn't help but ask, did Dante tell you that I get carsick? His voice was low. No. Then, just as I finished speaking, the traffic light turned red. Donahue stepped on the brake, and the car came to a steady stop. He turned to look at me, and I couldn't guess what he was thinking. I felt somewhat uneasy under his focused gaze and averted my eye. He smiled. You probably don't remember that incident. I looked at him in confusion. Once during a holiday in high school, I took the same bus as you. There were a lot of people on the bus. You were sitting by the window, next to an aunt with a child. I frowned. I had no memory of that at all. The child fell asleep shortly after, and you seemed worried he might catch a cold, so you closed the window. He paused for a moment before continuing. I noticed your face turning paler and paler and paler, your forehead covered in sweat, and it looked like your lips were trembling. You looked really uncomfortable, but you didn't say a word. Just closed your eyes and pretended to be asleep with your fist resting on the window. Donahue glanced at me. At that time, I thought, this desk mate, who usually looks so delicate, is quite strong. I blinked, and a vague memory slowly surfaced in my mind. I used to get carsick the worst in high school. I vaguely remembered later on, someone next to me changed, handing me a tissue to wipe my sweat and opening the window. But I hadn't paid much attention to who that person was. And it wasn't until after I got off the bus that I felt better. Suddenly, a thought struck me, and I asked, were you the one sitting next to me? Donahue answered straightforwardly, yes. I was taken aback. A strange feeling washed over me. The green light turned on, and Donahue restarted the car. He chuckled lightly. From that time on, I started paying attention to you. My heart skipped a beat. Actually, back then, I couldn't tell if it was like or curiosity, but I couldn't help but focus more on you. Donahue sighed, seeming a bit regretful. I was too dull back then, I whispered. I was also very dull. I hadn't noticed it all. Suddenly, I recalled that during a period when the lights in the classroom corridor were broken, I was always the last to leave after self-study. Donahue was leaving late too. Almost as soon as I left, he would follow. Looking back now, he must have wanted to walk with me down that corridor. In college, I looked for you once, Donahue said, his voice obscure. It was raining that day, and I saw you sharing an umbrella with a boy. He had his arms tightly around your waist, and you were affectionately resting your head on his chest. I remained silent. It wasn't until I felt a hollow emptiness in my heart that I realized what my feelings for you truly were. I looked up at him, and just then, he turned his head too, after a brief moment of eye contact. After getting out of the car, Donahue walked me to the door. I lowered my head and said, thank you for bringing me back. Just as I was about to turn and head upstairs, I felt a firm yet gentle grip on my wrist, seemingly avoiding the area where I had received the injection. I was startled. Actually, I lied to you, Donahue said, now very close to me. his deep voice mixed with a cold breath brushing against my ear. I almost forgot to pull away. What? I instinctively thought about the fact that he had sent Dante on a business trip. I don't seem to care as little as I appear, Donahue said, staring directly into my eyes. His gaze intense and warm. That day you rejected me. I couldn't sleep at all. I ran around the neighborhood 40 laps. I was really sad when you rejected me. I stared blankly at him, unsure of how to respond. Daphne, if you're not ready to start a new relationship right now. Donahue's dark eyes quietly watched me. It's okay, I can wait. After he left, I stood alone downstairs for a long time. I spotted a familiar figure not far away. In the moonlight, with the tree shadows swaying, Clarence stood there quietly. Daphne, he called my name softly, with a hint of pleading. I walked slowly towards him. When he saw me approach, he seemed genuinely surprised and called my name again. The next moment, I said clearly, Clarence, please don't come looking for me anymore. I lowered my head, my voice very soft. I will start a new life from now on, and I might even have a new relationship. Daphne. He repeated my name unconsciously, his voice filled with confusion and panic. Perhaps until this moment, he still held on to hope that we were just having a tiff. I didn't want to give him any false hopes anymore and finally managed to say, but that person will never be you. I had known Clarence for over 20 years and had been with him for 5. We had seen each other at our most miserable and vulnerable moments, confided in each other about our embarrassing and helpless situation, and warned each other as much as we could. I used to think we would be together for life, but suddenly everything changed. He fell in love with someone else. During those sleepless nights, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Why was I the only one desperately trying to maintain our relationship when he was the one who pursued me so fervently in the beginning? Turning back felt wrong. Moving forward felt wrong. I knew some people would gradually disappear with time, but I never imagined it would be in such a manner. Perhaps one day I would forgive him, but I could never continue to be with him again. After that day, Clarence never appeared again. As for Cynthia, she once sent me a message saying she was preparing to leave the city. But she didn't say much else. Although I didn't understand why she suddenly told me this, it didn't matter anymore. I had no feelings for her at all. Why she chose to give up on Clarence, whether she was doing well or not, was no longer my concern. Unknowingly, a year passed. A lot seemed to have happened in that year. I went home twice, wearing that light gray scarf. Later, I found out that the scarf wasn't what I thought. It was knitted by my mom for my brother, and my brother passed it on to me. From the very beginning, my mom had knitted that scarf for me. Also in that year, I made breakthrough progress at work. After breaking up with Clarence, I pushed myself to forget. But after so many years together, many aspects of my life inevitably bore his traces. It was not so simple to truly let go. To distract myself, I've volunteered for a new project. Bussying myself between the company and clients all day, my life filled to the brim with work. An unexpected gain was that, aside from the outstanding performance on the new project, I actually received 2 promotions in a year. In this non-stop busy life, gradually, one day, I suddenly realized that I hadn't thought about the past in a long time. Instead, my relationship with Donahue began to grow more subtle. Usually, when I got off work late, he would drive to pick me up. On weekends, we would watch movies and play games together. I could clearly feel that we were growing closer. Donahue's companionship and understanding helped me gradually find a comfortable state. I realized that I was slowly beginning to accept him. The day I officially got together with Donahue happened to be during a company team building event. Because of my outstanding performance, I was promoted and transferred, and my colleagues fed me a lot of drink. Donahue took me home while I was tipsy. At the moment he placed me on the bed, for some reason, I suddenly started to cry. Donahue had no choice but to hold me in his arms, his voice strangely hoarse. Why are you crying? Looking into his eyes, that subtle, indescribable feeling surged up again. I rested my head on his chest, wrapping my arms around his waist, and talked about many things. My mom, Clarence, Dante. Those people I had loved, hated, and resented. And those things I couldn't let go of were peeled away layer by layer and gradually rehealed before him. I'd always been very restrained, let alone being so straightforward. But Donahue always seemed to give me a sense of peace and strength. In the end, he sighed and told me softly yet firmly, "Some hurts are destined to be unforgivable. But even with hate, we still have the right to love and be loved." That night, Donahue stayed over, time flew by, and today was my birthday. Donahue was cooking in the kitchen, while Dante assisted him, watching the two of them bussying around. A strange feeling suddenly rose in my heart. My mom favored boys over girls, but Dante had always treated me very well. Over the years, Dante had always been like a powerful beam of light, warming me. Later, due to a series of misunderstandings, Donahue and I crossed paths again because he joined a new company. Donahue was like the moon after the rain, calmly and gently respecting me in a silent way, accompanying me, making me feel comfortable and suited. Now, they had both become indispensable parts of my life, steadfast and full of security. They were still busy in the kitchen while I was in the living room opening an anonymous package. It was a ring. Gently turning the ring, I saw two letters engraved on the inside, JC. Inside the delivery box, there was a small note that read, "Happy birthday, wishing you peace year after year." For a moment, I was taken aback. I'd actually seen this ring a year ago. That day, I had just finished showering and was looking for the hairdo when I accidentally found it in the second drawer of the nightstand on Clarence's side. I had been waiting for Clarence to say something, even subtly hinting at it, but he remained completely silent. At that time, I couldn't understand why, even though he had already bought the ring, he was taking so long to speak up. It wasn't until later when he took me to the movies, and just as the climax hit, the male lead knelt on one knee to propose to the female lead, that I finally mustered the courage to close my eyes slightly and ask him softly, "Clarence, you bought a ring too, didn't you?" He didn't answer. A sudden sense of foreboding welled up in my heart. I stiffly turned my head and found him smiling down at his phone. In the video was that girl named Cynthia. Suddenly, it all clicked, the reason for his hesitation.